Welcome to Generation Digital Workforce, the podcast that's here to explore the role of robotic process automation and other digital technologies. Whether you're just getting started or you're looking for advanced strategies and tactics, if you're curious about where human and digital workers are coming together to transform the future of work, then this podcast is for you. All right, let's get into the show.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Marchuk, and I'd like to introduce our special guest for this episode, Dr. Daniel Araya. Daniel is a consultant advisor with a special interest in artificial intelligence, technology policy, and governance. He's the co-founder of AN Advisors, an international consultants and think tank providing strategic research on artificial intelligence and the future of work. Daniel is also a senior fellow for the Center for International Governance and Innovation and a senior partner for the World Legal Summit. Welcome, Daniel.
Oh, thank you very much, Michael.
You have a lot of stuff in there.
I know. That's right. Yeah.
So, in addition to all of that, you've written several books on the transformation to a digital society and augmented intelligence. And you wrote an interesting article on Forbes that called "The Coming Digital Renaissance." And when I think about Renaissance, I think about a cultural awakening in an age of arts and creativity and exploration. Can you describe what this digital renaissance might look like?
Yeah, so a lot of people are feeling a little cynical and gloomy right now because, so many convergent problems are overlapping, whether it's the current election challenges in the United States or the rise of strongmen around the world or fears around artificial intelligence displacing the labor force, hydrocarbons, the list goes on and on. We seem to be at the end of a cycle which has nothing but downsides. And it's, I think, very difficult for people to imagine the upside of transitioning beyond what looks like a chasm of challenges. And I was trying to frame out how I perceive this all going. And I use the Renaissance as a metaphor or a model for what we're going through, which is to say that I look at the Renaissance as a transitional period lasting centuries between the Middle Ages and modernity. And I think what's coming will be as different from our current social structures or current civilization as the Middle Ages were as we are from the Middle Ages. And so what we're seeing right now is a massive disruption of institutions that we've taken for granted for over a century, at least since the end of World War II, but probably earlier than that when you talk about bureaucracy or the command and control systems, which go back to the Middle Ages or even before. But what I mean by digital renaissance is to say that digital technologies are a platform that are leverageable for creative expression, innovation, democracy, and ingenuity. And what anchored the original Renaissance, the European Renaissance, was really a worldview around humanism, which is to say that man is the measure of all things. And I think what's coming is a kind of transition beyond an industrial era in which factory labor anchored our self-understanding, where we're in many ways an extension of the factory or extension of machines, into an era in which machines become cognitive enough to do a lot of the routine or rudimentary labor that we've been doing, or that slaves did before modernity, right? If you look at the Greeks or the Roman civilizations, or even before that. And so beyond the chasm of challenges we're facing at the moment, what I see is a highly automated infrastructure that will allow a platform of creativity and innovation that will be anchored to a rejuvenated humanism, which is to say that the human will be brought back as the machine becomes foundational to our basic needs. And in many ways, I think this is what a lot of science fiction has been looking to portray, and philosophers, Enlightenment philosophers, including Karl Marx, perceive that technology, as it reaches maturity, would provide us with leverageable tools or instruments to refashion our society. And I think we're on the precipice of that now. And the reason it seems so difficult, why we seem to be in nothing but crisis, is that these are something like the birth pangs of a new era. And so the suffering that accompanies it is exactly like the birth the experience of birth pangs of giving birth to something new. And so, although on the surface it looks quite difficult and challenging, the reality is that on the other side of it, it'll be quite impressive. And I don't mean to say that it'll be perfect or that it'll be a false utopia, but that the challenges we'll face will be very different from the challenges we've been facing up till now.
Well, I can imagine, based on the way the world is changing, we're not going to see 400 years of a Renaissance period to make that transition. I imagine it's going to happen much more rapidly than that. What are your thoughts on the transition itself? And when did we start it? When did we start this transition?
Well, so there's a lot of parallels, right, with the initial Renaissance. I mean, if you look at the printing press, there's a parallel in the internet. And I think it's, if you look at energy changes, I mean, we're clearly transitioning beyond fossil fuels, not just because we need to, because of climate change, but because clean energy technologies, solar, wind, and battery are now becoming cost effective and are the decelerating prices associated with their production and then eventually distribution. The price and costs associated with that shift are falling fast enough that they're outstripping the fossil fuels that we've depended upon up to now. And so the convergence of all these forces enable a change that is fairly deep and wide. To say when it started, I would guess, it's a bit arbitrary at this point in history to be able to go, what was the first, the day it happened. But I think, the arrival of the computer certainly transformed the potential for remaking institutions as well as remaking our technologies, right? And I think that each of these technologies that feed on the computer or the microprocessor have led to disruptive changes that emerge out of this original shift. And I think that part of the change, to critique the argument, because I know I sound when I say that somewhat deterministic about technology, but the reality is that it's not just technological change, it's also social or institutional change. And that's what we're struggling with now, is what are the right social institutions that lock together with these technological changes. And unfortunately, the technologies have moved ahead of our ability to manage them through our institutions. And so that's where we're struggling now.
And that makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned something in your article about government transforming to become more automated to support us. I've worked with the government teams in our organization for quite some time, and I know that government doesn't necessarily move that quickly. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit more about what you see with this automated government structure.
Right. So there's two or three things I want to say about that. One, I'm not saying that government will transform first. Clearly the transformation is occurring in the private sector, and that's then accelerating changes elsewhere, right? So whether it's the internet or it's digital technologies more broadly or it's AI, what we're seeing is a massive transformation of the capacities that the market are providing for us, or the tools, the resources the market are providing for us to then alter our life almost completely. And government will have to adapt to that. And one of the reasons why government is so critical to this is that if you're familiar with theories on cycles of change around the economy, right? Debt cycles or bubbles and busts. We're clearly probably at the peak of a financial bubble for sure, but an economic bubble that if and when it does burst will require us to rebuild, just like, the post-war World War II generation had to after the Great Depression and World War II. I think, that's gloomy, but I think that's kind of where we're at now. I think in terms of cycles of history, where we're facing a disruptive change that is then impacting our markets and our economy, and that our institutions will have to respond to. And the only institution that will be capable of weathering that kind of massive transformation will be government. And so, in other words, if we lost government, we would lose everything, I think. And so it will be incumbent upon government at some point, and different forms too. I mean, the Chinese obviously are not going to align themselves with the democracies that we have in the West, but they clearly we're going to have similar economic and social problems, especially because they're so centralized. It might be even more difficult for them to adapt, but it's debatable. But at least in terms of democracies, we're going to need to turn to government in order to leverage. So as a more concrete example, as AI and machine learning begin to, and software more specifically, begin to eat into white collar labor, you're going to see the disruption of the labor force parallels the disruption of factory work in the 70s. And as that picks up, it's going to begin to cause a certain amount of panic in society. And the only institutions we have available to manage that level of change is government. And so, and keeping in mind, of course, the government is very conservative, it's slow moving, it's highly bureaucratic, tends to be the least digitized. But the fact is that in order for any social system to remain coherent, to avoid total collapse and implosion, you need government. And so the other factor to keep in mind is that government, by and large, around the world, is the largest employer of citizens. So in most Western countries, it's something like 20% of the labor force. In Scandinavia and more socialized societies, it can be upwards of a third. And so it may be the last bastion of security for the old 9-to-5 labor force. So in that sense, it'll be even more challenging for government to make this shift. But in the end, simply because of the extremes, the backlash and extremes of social change that we're going to be facing and are already starting to face, it'll be up to government to sort of come in and support it.
So I have a question regarding that. So you're looking at government eventually changing it, but as you mentioned, the corporate world changes much more rapidly. So as an executive who is preparing for this new automated society, or where automation becomes a very deep-rooted part of their organization, how should they be planning right now to take advantage of this new shift?
Well, that's a difficult question because, there are different sizes of industries, or different sizes of institutions and companies within industries, and also there are different domains of specialization depending on the specific industry. Some industries are much further along the innovation curve than others. Obviously, you can see in the tech sector already this lateral movement across different industrial domains like Amazon or Facebook that are becoming very much monopolies because they have less need for a bureaucratic labor force. They can leverage algorithms and the internet to do a lot more than, say, a much more slow-moving company like, a manufacturing or food production or something that is maybe labor-intensive. But in the end, all companies, I believe anyway, will end up having to adapt themselves to highly digitized infrastructure that can leverage robotics to do some of the rudimentary labor, but then an AI and simulations to provide, say, executives, to go speak to your question more directly, using AI and simulations to help orienting companies with the direction of travel and the challenges that they may be facing from competitors or from the global marketplace as it adjusts. And I think it's going to be inevitable that executives are going to leverage AI and machine learning and simulations specifically more and more to provide them with competitive advantage, because labor, even high-skilled labor, will not be that advantage when it comes to AI and machine learning. There is maybe a leverageable advantage to creativity and design, sort of broad generalists, but even there, I think that might be short-lived. Depending on the industry, obviously. If you're in an industry that focuses on aesthetics or design, that's going to be key. But there is functions within AI of generative design that can begin to leverage data and math to provide simulated solutions to market-driven problems. So short answer, it really depends. But over the long term, I would imagine if I were an executive in industry A, then I would want to leverage whatever tools my competitors were using. And one of those tools is clearly going to be AI and simulation. So that's going to be critical.
So as the labor force changes, you kind of brought up the transition from a more manufacturing base in the 70s to more information work as we grew in time. Obviously, the labor force is going to have to adapt to this. Based on some of your work in sort of the education field and this future of education, where do you see this going for the employees of these organizations? What should they be doing to prepare for this transition?
So employees, when you say human resources, in the sense
Correct.
Of leveraging, yeah. So I think that's also very tricky. And again, it's industry specific. It depends on the industry. Like you can see in, say, Elon Musk, who now is kind of in many ways a standard bearer of the creative executive, right? More so even than Google, I think. Or sort of a new Steve Jobs, maybe to simplify it. You see Musk and even Google, for that matter, becoming more and more indifferent to qualifications and degrees and diplomas because the challenges they're facing are so unique to the new innovative systems they're creating, that in a sense there's no model to work from for students, right? There is no case studies to work from. This is something you have to do in the field in the moment. And so I think what they want is ambitious, curious people that can fight through difficulties and challenges to solve problems. And the resources that are emerging around self-learning with YouTube and Khan Academy or whatever, those offer a certain advantage. Now, this is not to say, I have a PhD with a focus on education policy. This is not to say that education doesn't matter or don't get a degree, but it is to say that I don't think formal education will in any way save people from unemployment or displacement or underemployment. So the reality is that formal education, which used to be perceived as a feeder into the market or into industry, which really since throughout the whole industrial revolution, that was its large focus for mass education, that's changing. And so it's still important to get basic skills or advanced skills in schooling institutions, college degrees, university degrees. These can help feed that process. But the onus is much more on the learner to acquire the skills individually, independently of any institution in a direction where their curiosity lies. So to simplify, say for listeners who maybe have children or are themselves students, I would say that move away from a perception of the world in which extrinsic reward is the key to success. In other words, getting good grades or measuring yourself by your salary. Instead, think about intrinsic motivation. What genuinely drives you, right? What would make you fight through a problem like getting to Mars, right? Or building their first electric car. These kinds of challenges, which, genuinely curious people will seek to solve regardless of extrinsic reward. That's really what we're going to need to think about for the whole of society.
To me, that makes a lot of sense. We've seen that along the spectrum of employees that we've hired, and certainly along the path that I've taken in my past. One of the challenges that we see, as you kind of alluded to earlier, is labor is somewhat slower to adapt to this. We had quite a few people that have become very well entrenched in a specific corporate role or corporate job, who've been there 20, 30 years sometimes. What kind of advice would you have for someone in that kind of role?
Well, it's very tricky. I mean, when you're in a secure position, when you have a title or status, you become dependent upon the leverageable ecosystem that you're now embedded in. And so you don't want to leave that. And that can be a recipe for disaster because, to put it in generational terms, the baby boom generation had a very standardized upbringing and an expectation of a standardized education and in turn a standardized job. Each generation after that has found themselves in a much more challenging environment in which jobs are less standardized for sure, but less stable. And so you have this situation where everyone is maybe overly educated, spending too much in education, getting out, and then moving from job to job and often from industry to industry every few years. And I think that kind of intercyclical change is going to grow more disruptive. And so it's very difficult for me to give advice on how to stabilize yourself in that world, right? It's, a very choppy environment. And I think that, again, I would fall back on what I said earlier, which is just, what do you really want to do, right? Where does your passion lie? If you're sitting in a cubicle doing a job you don't like and your passion's not there, then by and large, what would probably happen is someone else will take that job eventually, or a software will take that job, especially if it's routine work where you're not learning much at all, but you're qualified, you're skilled, but your skill set doesn't change. Then I would say that you should be looking for alternative industries or alternative spaces where new work will emerge, where creative work will emerge. And that's tricky to speculate on.
So let's take that one step further, because I think it's an interesting point. A lot of the folks who are in an industry, now let's pick one that I know typically has folks that have a longer longevity in their career path, and that's sort of insurance. They've done an insurance path. They have 30 years of insurance experience in there. How could they take that experience in their current role within their industry and approach this a different way, rather than to say, I will find my passion, which may not be insurance, but they have all this experience in it. What could they be doing to leverage that experience to transition into this new world?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned insurance. My mother worked in insurance her whole life, so I know the industry somewhat. So in the case of someone who's mature and middle-aged and has been in that role for 20, 30 years, I think it's tricky to imagine them, moving horizontally or laterally to another field. But if you're young and you're available to risk, some level of risk, then I would say look at the alternative models of insurance that are going to emerge. Like if you look at what Tesla is trying to do in insuring their self-driving cars, there are new business models to be new business cases to be made, and new business models to standardize a shift to a highly electronic civilization. And so you have to think outside the box, right? That's obviously the key. And become enamored or at least available to the idea that you want to embrace innovation rather than resist it, and that you can work alongside others who can perceive where this is going, right? If whatever your specialized skill might be. So for example, you may be an expert in marketing, or you may be good at managing people, or you may be good at quantitative, mathematical, data-driven type stuff, or maybe you just like software and coding. Whatever it is, you should work amongst and within a team or community of people that complement your skills and begin to become supportive of this innovational change, as opposed to trying to stop it or undermine it, or just dismiss it because for the sake of maintaining psychological security. This is not the time for that, right? The scale or scope of disruption that's coming won't be something we can dismiss. It's not something we can put off. The acceleration is built into the nature of computational technologies, which now embed everything, regardless of the industry.
I'm sensing a sense of urgency in what you're talking about now. Organizations that are either slow to move or haven't started this journey to transform themselves now, what would your advice to them be?
Well, let me use a concrete example. I'm writing an article right now on the U.S. military. And it's a difficult argument to make, but just to give you a sense of the landscape of change that we're facing. The U.S. military is the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the world, right? Fossil fuels are plateauing. In fact, they're going into decline. And as that occurs, the whole infrastructure that supports the U.S. military will struggle because the costs associated with fossil fuels won't be justifiable as electricity-driven technologies come online. And this is something the car industry is facing. If you look at Detroit or Germany, they too will struggle. And I think that the scale of this disruption provides a lot of opportunity for smart entrepreneurs to cut in from new angles to find new markets, right? That's the real answer in the end. Now, this is not to say that everyone has to be an entrepreneur. There's intrapreneuring within organizations, but it is to say that you have to think creatively and you have to think disruptively. Now, if you can maintain that mindset, then you may well want to be an entrepreneur, because even if you build a company that isn't hugely successful, you may be bought by a larger company, or you may provide insight that the experience itself may provide you with insight that allows you to then find your place somewhere else, right? The whole thing is to be uncomfortable and to stay in that discomfort long enough that you learn. Because in the end, learning is the only factor that's going to save people from being displaced.
So what's one of the biggest takeaways that you would want the listeners to have after going through this material and some of the things that you've been working on? What's the biggest takeaway you see for them?
Well, there's a lot of things that I would say people should be thinking about, but maybe I'll just speak for myself. The biggest takeaway for me, I was an academic. I was doing research. I had fully expected to be a tenure track professor and eventually work in the academy. But some time spent in Silicon Valley dissuaded me of the credibility of most of what the academy was doing. And I thought, if technology can move at this speed, how does it impact society? And so this set me on a new course of research. And I think that for me personally, and this is something Ray Kurzweil always points out, is we human beings have a very difficult time thinking in exponential terms, right? In terms of doubling. We think linearly, and that's unconscious to the species. And so the challenge is to begin to understand exponential curves, right? The doubling of change. And to realize that, this hockey stick of change looks like a linear curve at first, but then eventually accelerates upward very quickly. And so in these early stages of change where, you hear, innovation and exponential change is something that is inevitable. It's very easy to minimize the reality of that because you look around and you think, well, how much has really changed, right? I mean, we have iPhones now or smartphones and, maybe we're getting electric cars, but, is that substantial in and of itself? And the point is to think, as the World Economic Forum has pointed out in their, discourse on the on the fourth industrial revolution, these technologies are convergent. So it's not just AI or clean tech or biotech or 3D printing or Bitcoin and blockchain. It's all of these things converging together. And as they converge, the transformative effect is very dramatic. And to look back at history as examples, like one very small example is people always point out the shift from horse and buggy to the car, right? I mean, that was actually a very quick change. That was over like less than a decade. So if you look at pictures of New York in like 1905, it's nothing but horses. And then something like 1915, it's nothing but cars, right? And so that kind of dramatic shift has happened throughout the course of history. These kind of punctuated changes suddenly occur and change the system around people in a way that is very unpredictable. But to keep in mind, as an adaptive species, we will adapt, right? So I have full confidence that we'll get control over this. We'll adjust our social systems appropriately. We'll rebuild our institutions to, come to terms with exponential change. But the journey, the struggle to cross that chasm is going to be difficult. And I think we're just in the early phases of it. I think the 2020s will be dramatically different from the 2010s or the 2000s or the 1990s. I think by the end of this decade, we'll probably be on the other side of the chasm. But I think it's going to be a rough ride.
Wow. Well, Daniel, I want to thank you for the time we get to spend talking today. This has been very insightful, and I really appreciate your deep thoughts on these very important issues.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very good to meet you.
You've been listening to Generation Digital Workforce. If you want to hear more about RPA, AI, and other cognitive technologies that are shaping the future of work, join us next time as we continue to go deeper on these topics with industry innovators and experts. To make sure you never miss a future episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. And if you've liked what you heard today, please leave us a review. It's one of the best ways to help more people find valuable content. For show notes and more info, visit us at blueprism.com/podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.